All right, so welcome to Toolbox episode 1 for Dialectics, DBT, and skills that you can learn. This is being put on by Youth Eastside Services, as well as in partnership with the Lake Washington School District, and this is our first session, so orientation and dialectics. You get to control the slides, Kaylin, so I can't do anything.
I'm trying.
Awesome. So a little quick preview about what Youth Eastside Services does. So Youth Eastside Services is a behavioral health service provider for children and youth ages birth to 22, and we serve families in East King County, so Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, and Sammamish. We also work with the schools in the local school districts, so the Lake Washington School District, as well as the Bellevue School District. So that is Youth Eastside Services. We provide, like I said, behavioral health, which includes mental health counseling for youth and families, substance use and co-occurring disorder counseling, as well as community education and prevention programs. So what myself and Kaylin, when we get to our introductions, that is primarily what we do, is the community education and prevention piece in the Lake Washington School District. If you would like to reach out to Youth Eastside Services for any reason, we're currently offering virtual treatment as well as in-person services. You can go to the website listed there. You can also call this number and talk to our open access office to get an intake scheduled if you'd like, as well as follow us on all of the various social media platforms. Also, as always, if you need to reach out to anybody else, you are more than welcome to contact King County, the 24-hour crisis line, which is listed here. If there is any sort of emergency that is not appropriate for 911, such as mental health or substance use related crisis, you can call or text. There also is Teen Link, which is a line that is staffed by teens for teens, and you can go to teenlink.org as well. To connect with those folks. So if Youth Eastside Services is not the right place and there's more of an emergent situation, these are the places you would want to contact. Just as a disclosure, this group and this format is not meant to be a crisis situation at all. It's also not meant to be therapeutic necessarily. We are here to teach you guys skills that can be useful for your life and to apply to your life. And for some folks, they might need more services such as mental health or co-occurring counseling, but we're just kind of here to provide skills. I think of what we're doing is a little bit like driver's ed. We're kind of teaching you how to do things, the rules of the road, but the real work happens in therapy or out in the real world. So that's just a disclosure about us. So we are these two folks. You can see pictures of ourselves on the screen. So my name is Delaney Not-Nearest. I am the school-based behavioral health coordinator. I focus on a project called SBIRT, but I am a social worker by training as well as a drug and alcohol counselor. So I'm co-occurring.
And my name is Kaylin Griffith. I am also on the behavioral health support specialist team, and I support similarly students in middle school, just trying to navigate different things, including like skill building and like education prevention things. And I am a licensed mental health counselor and substance use disorder trainee by trade.
The materials that we are going over today and throughout this 16-week series comes from these two resources. So Kaylin and I both are trained in foundational DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy. Youth Eastside Services is a DBT-informed agency. All of the materials and things that we know come from these two resources. Marsha Linehan is the creator of DBT. She's actually local too, which is really cool. And a lot of the work she does at Behavioral Tech is in partnership with UW. So a lot of the content comes from DBT skills in schools. If anybody is interested in looking at that material, we're kind of focusing on how to do this in schools, but everything we do comes from these two resources. So credit where credit is due.
All right, so for our first webisode of this series, we're going to be just setting some quick expectations for what this toolbox series will have and what Delaney and I are going to be doing every week. We're going to introduce you guys to dialectical behavior therapy in general as a treatment modality, and then we're going to start in on what today's specific skill is, which is dialectical thinking. More on that later. We're also going to try and give you something to try at home every week, so you can apply the skills that we talk about every week. And as well, we'll host a Q&A, so if you have any questions about the material covered in this session or in later series in past sessions, feel free to bring those up to us at that point. And just to quickly cover some of the expectations that you can have while joining these webinars, we're basically just going to be discussing different skills. And Delaney and I are going to be teaching each other the skills and discussing how we use them. So you can experience like how professionals might be talking about these things and thinking about ways that you can use them in your own lives as well. As well, while we're going through this, we're going to try our very, very best to use non-judgmental language and host a learning environment. This is a place where folks can feel like they're making mistakes or analyzing their own thinking and having a safe space to do that. And as we're going through this, it would be really helpful if we're thinking about applying these skills. So thinking about situations in your own life and bringing those to the table to think about when you're joining would be really helpful.
So before I jump into what is DBT, in the chat, we dropped two documents. One of them is the slides, but the other one is kind of meant to be a handout to follow along with while we're presenting. So you can download that and just open it up and type in any notes along with us. It's kind of meant to be interactive so that you can say, okay, cool, I'm writing this down. I know what I'm seeing and learning, as well as just stay engaged. There's a couple of things on there that will be things that you can do and practice. Some goals that you can set for yourself. So that's meant to be super helpful. If you haven't done that already, I would recommend that you do that now before we jump into the content. So what is DBT? It's important to kind of define the things that we're talking about. So the D in DBT means dialectical. So a dialectic is a synthesis or integration of opposites. We're going to end up talking about that more because our skill for today is dialectical thinking. It's something that we do in DBT and something that's been really useful in at least my own life of just kind of thinking about, okay, yes, and there's more than one way to look at things, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But that's the D of DBT. The B in DBT stands for behavioral, which means that this whole approach is we're assessing situations and how we respond and what we do in those situations, with the idea that if we look at our behaviors and we start thinking about changing our behaviors or changing our actions, that will then result in ways that can move us forward with our goals and what we're working on, right? Or our problems that we're facing in our lives, is looking at what are we doing in this situation, what can we control, and how do we move forward? So it's a behavioral based model. And then the T in DBT stands for therapy. So DBT is usually done individually with a therapist and a client. It is also done in group where people are learning skills and then talking together about those skills. We're sort of trying to simulate that group experience in this format. It's a little bit harder because we wanted folks to have that low barrier of engagement without maybe feeling like they needed to share anything or needed to sort of process or anything like that. And that's also harder to do in a larger space. So we're hoping that you're getting the piece of what we would instruct as if it was a group, but you're doing most of the work kind of on your own or in partnership potentially with others in your life or with a counselor if you have one. So that's kind of how we're approaching this and why, again, it's thinking about, okay, what is the situation? What are our behaviors and what do we do about it? The real sort of struggle, or not struggle, the challenge that we all face when it comes to therapy or any sort of anything really, is this trying to balance or shift acceptance and change. And that's kind of what all DBT is about. We have these really great foundational assumptions that we may or may not go into throughout this course, but there's this assumption that everybody is doing the best that they can and everybody can do better. So acknowledging and accepting that, yeah, I'm doing the best that I can right now, and I can probably do something different and do something better. So this kind of teeter-totter-esque that I think we all find ourselves in quite frequently is, okay, I'm going to accept the way that I am, and maybe today I'm leaning a little bit more into that space, but also I maybe need to make some change. So how can I maybe shift into this space? And that's kind of how we're looking at all of this. Caitlin, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the acceptance and change as well to add.
I mean, just as like a quick story, the way that Marsha Linehan used to talk about this, or at least what I've heard from the way that Marsha Linehan used to describe this, is when she was first starting like creating DBT, she noticed that her clients would kind of shuffle between acceptance and change, where those are kind of the main things that are emphasized in a lot of therapies, where they would come and they would experience a lot of validation, a lot of like their therapist telling them, yes, that makes sense. Like, of course you feel this way. Like, it's not just you that's causing all these problems. And then they would work that way for a while. And then after a while, nothing was changing in their lives. They were still experiencing the same things. And they're like, why aren't you helping us change? Why are you just being so accepting? And then when she tried to focus on change instead, her clients would be like, great, these are great skills, but why are you trying to change everything about me? Why can't you accept some of those pieces about me? You really realize that it's more about that balance than anything else. You need both of these things to achieve the goals that a lot of the clients who are in DBT are trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. So a good example could be like, we're going to return to school next week, at least in the Lake Washington School District. That's something that we have to accept. Doesn't mean that we have to like it. Doesn't mean we have to think it's the best thing that's ever going to happen to us. It might not be for some people. And well, I know it is causing a lot of stress and anxiety for a lot of people, both adults and youth. And that also comes with changes that we're going to have to make, right? We're going to have to change. Some of us will have to change our routines entirely. For a lot of the students I work with, they're going to have to get up early. It was early compared to before, because school used to start at 9 virtually. And, most of them just rolled out of bed at like 8:40 or 8:59 to get signed in at 9 o'clock. So that is something I've been really thinking about when it comes to DBT, is this return to school and accepting that it's got to happen. And what are the changes that I need to make it happen? The other thing about DBT is how do we sort of do this, right? How do we look at our behaviors and change certain things and accept certain things, and then also increase other things? So DBT has 4 units. I'll start with that first, which is the sort of the right side of the chart. Kaylin and I are going to go through all 4 of these topics throughout our series. The first one is mindfulness, which is kind of thinking about grounding techniques, things like that. Then we have distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. So that's kind of like where we're going in this unit and in this series. But the reason why is, if we look on the left side of the chart, there are certain behaviors that most folks, reading this, would like to decrease these things. Top one being confusion, not feeling aware of why things are occurring, difficulty focusing, maybe impulsive behaviors, risky decisions. I'm sure we've all made a choice that we make in that moment and then realize later we're like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But you did it for a reason, whatever that reason is, and thinking about, okay, in the future, how do I maybe do something a little bit different? Also, avoidance. Avoidance is super huge right now, at least with the students that I'm working with, in terms of avoiding school, avoiding things that have to do with the pandemic, just because we've been in it so long and it's been really, really tough. Other things on that list that we're trying to sort of decrease when it comes to DBT is liable affect, sort of meaning that, I guess not, how do your emotions impact you, right? And what that sort of looks like. Sometimes for some people, it can be really, really high emotions. They're kind of always, going 60 miles an hour, if not faster, very, very escalated. And then also on the flip side though, too, it can be that other space where you just feel kind of blank and just almost like there's no emotions. So feeling like emotions control you in either way, like you have so many of them, or maybe sometimes you don't have hardly any of them and you just kind of feel empty, kind of thinking about where we'd like to be kind of in the middle with that, right? And be able to experience emotions like joy and happiness, which we can't experience if we also don't experience sadness and anger and some of the other things. And finding that, again, that balance. And then finally, interpersonal chaos, fear of abandonment, and low self-respect. So all the kind of things when we work with others that sometimes will be impacting people, which is why we have the things we want to increase are those kind of 4 units we're going to go through. So how are we going to do this, right? How do we address things? This slide is very orange, and I apologize for that. I'm like, wow, my eyeballs. So as someone who personally just sometimes thinks about decisions and like, oh my gosh, I have to make so many decisions, this has been really helpful for me. So there's 4 ways DBT thinks about things, and there's 4 ways you can address any problem in your entire life, which feels kind of wild to think about. But realistically, there's this truth to it. You can do option 1, which is stay miserable, which means if we translate it over to using skills or not using skills, it's we don't use any skills. So the left is kind of like how we can approach the problem, and then the right is what we can do in terms of skills and DBT and plug things in. So stay option 1, we can stay miserable and do absolutely nothing, which means we use no skills. We just function the way we're functioning. And people might actually already have skills, They just maybe don't know that that's what they are, or to label them in the DBT way. So most likely people are using skills, but for the most part, it's just deciding I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stay miserable, not going to do anything. Number two is you can tolerate the problem. So sometimes we have things that we encounter that we do need to be able to just tolerate. Perfect example, going back to school. We need to go back to school, be in the buildings, and we need to just sort of tolerate that situation that we are going to experience. Ways that we can do that is with distress tolerance as well as mindfulness. So that is a second option you can, when you have any problem, is you can just choose to tolerate it. You cannot do anything. You can choose to kind of let it be and not react to it at all, which is just tolerating, which is option two. And then option three is feeling better about the problem. Not necessarily meaning we're going to change anything, but you'd like to feel differently about it. And that is the skill of emotion regulation in terms of, okay, if we're looking at return to school and I'm just tolerating it, that kind of means I'm just preventing myself from getting more escalated. If I'm thinking about return to school and feeling better about return to school, then that might be looking at my emotions and like, okay, thinking about things like we do things called like a mindfulness activity with like a half smile, right? Where we intentionally put our bodies in situations that mimic feeling happiness and joy. So thinking about, okay, my posture in return to school is very like, no, don't want to do it, arms crossed, fists clenched, intentionally being like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to kind of release my body and sit in a way that's like, okay, I'm going to sit and be attentive and focused in class and imagine myself being focused in class to then sort of help regulate our emotions. So option three to a problem is change to feel better about the problem. And then finally, option four is you can solve the problem. And solving the problem, you need skills like, again, dialectics, thinking about interpersonal effectiveness, which is how we engage with other people, as well as thinking about problem solving skills like pros and cons, making a choice. So for return to school, an option for solving the problem might be you don't return to school. And that could work for some people, especially during the pandemic. That might be more stress. So maybe they solve the problem by doing a pros and cons sheet of like, I don't actually think I should return to school. Here's why, and the pros outweigh the cons. Or it could be the other situation, right? Like maybe you're not doing well in school and returning to school actually would be the best thing for you. And you figure that out through pros and cons. And you know that like solving the problem of the fact that I'm failing everything might be better addressed if I try to do it in school. So as simple as it might be, there's 4 ways to address any problem. Stay miserable, tolerate it, feel better, or solve the problem. And we're going to show you how to kind of do that through the 16-week course.
All right. And now we are going to kind of start shifting a little bit into our actual skill that we're going to be teaching this week. But first, before we do that, we wanted to kind of present this self-check-in. And for those of you that are joining us, there is these same little scales on the handout. So you can also look at the handout and circle things or interact with it that way. But thinking about your emotions, looking at the 0 to 10 scale, where 10 kind of reflects the intensity of what's going on, do you feel on a given day, in a given week, in a given month, that you are completely in control of your emotions and never have to try and push them away or change them? Or all the way on the opposite side of that, do you ever feel like your emotions control everything you do instead of you controlling them? And on the other side of that, do you feel like maybe you don't have emotions or you try not to have emotions, which is also pretty valid? Just for my own self check-in, if I were thinking about this scale, I would probably fall right in the middle. I think it really depends. What about you, Delaney?
I think, I mean, if I'm being honest with myself, especially with return to school and the emotions I feel around it, I probably would be a little bit higher right now, maybe like a 6 or a 7 potentially. Just because I know that I can get kind of escalated sometimes in meetings and, my frustrations will feel like they control me.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point too, that this totally depends on your context, what's going on around you, what the things are that's influencing your emotions, because your emotions do not just exist in your head. They are totally influenced by everything else that's going on around you as well. The next piece on here is confusion or distraction. A 0 or low intensity would be, I am always completely comfortable with and aware of who I am, how I think, and how I feel. Spoiler alert, that is definitely not me. On the other end of this scale, I've got, I am not at all comfortable or aware of who I am, how I think, or how I feel. And for me, I mean, I think this one is also one that tends to shift depending on what the situation is, what the context is that you might be considering how you think or feel. Because I think there are certain places where people tend to know how they feel pretty well. Like if I were thinking about interacting with my family members, I would have a pretty good idea of what my thoughts might be, who I am in my family unit, and how I feel. If I were entering into a completely new environment, I might be at a much higher intensity for my confusion, distraction, and what kinds of things are influencing how I am. Right now, just to give a quick example, I am probably about a 4 on this scale. How about you?
I think this one I'm a little bit more comfortable with than maybe the emotions one. I think I'm probably maybe like a 2. Although I do often think about what I think. And I think the thinking piece for me might be a little bit different.
Yeah, I think this is the one that's more influenced by the return to school for me than the
Yeah.
emotions one. So again, different contexts will affect different people in these scales in different ways. Next, we've got impulsiveness. So thinking about when your emotions do get really, really big, do you make that quick decision that feels really easy, or do you feel like you can kind of take it slower and make a decision that's more based on like thought and like rational thinking and your emotions all combined into one? So on the low intensity here, I am always in control of my behaviors. They are never impulsive or emotion based. Or all the way on that 10, my behavior is always out of control and it's always impulsive or always emotion based. For me, I feel like I'm usually in pretty good behavioral control of like what my decision making is. So I'm probably a 2 on this scale. How about you, Delaney?
I think I also maybe am in that space. But what's interesting too about these scales, and that we also want to think about, and that we often just think about as therapists too, is just because these are a scale and it's a 0 and a 10, it doesn't necessarily mean that one side is good, quote unquote, and that one side is bad, quote unquote. And I think we can kind of see this in terms of impulsiveness, because I know in my life, sometimes impulsivity is actually kind of good, in the sense that if, say, somebody's like, hey, I really want to go see a movie, are you free right now? Which I know is a little bit different in COVID times, but like, I've never really been a good person to not have a plan. Like, I like to know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. So when I kind of look at this scale, I was thinking almost on the opposite side of like, my rigidity sometimes in that way can be a something that I don't necessarily want all the time. Like, I would like to feel more comfortable making decisions in the moment instead of like sitting and thinking about them so intently like I often do. So I do think I am a little bit lower on the scale here as well, but also part of me kind of wants some of that impulsivity. And that could maybe be something that I think about and work on through this series as well. So I think I'd maybe be like, I think to be honest, I'm like a 0, in the sense that like I just ruminate and think way too hard on a lot of stuff, but I'd maybe like to be like a 4.
I mean, I agree with you. I am also kind of on the side of like, I wish I were more impulsive. And I think we are going to definitely be returning to this conversation actually next week when we talk about wise mind and the difference between emotion mind, reason mind. And I think that is super relevant to impulsiveness, and just willingness to either go with the flow or needing a plan, all of that stuff. And then our last one on here for our self-check-in is thinking about relationship problems. So going outside of just you as the person that we're examining with our skills, and thinking about the way that we interact with our communities. Do you feel like you always have great relationships, feel great about yourself in your relationships, and always feel comfortable asking for things or saying no? On the other hand of this, my relationships are all over the place. I don't really think I have the right to ever ask people for things. And I always give people what they want because I'm a bad person if I don't. And I think I know people who fall very much on either side of the scale. And honestly, on this one, I am definitely going to be more on the right side. I think I'm probably about an 8 on this one. You, Delaney?
I think this one I'm pretty solidly in the middle. I'd say maybe a 5.
Absolutely. All right, so we have gotten to our skill of the week, which is dialectics. And hopefully at this point, you have heard this word several times already. And I just want to remind folks that dialectics basically refer to two opposite things, or seemingly opposite things, can exist and be true at the same time. So the way that we have decided to teach this is by presenting some optical illusions, because this is a really, really great example, a childhood example really, of things that we are already familiar with being two things being true at the same time. So Delaney, think about this first image on here. What's the first thing that you see?
The first time I look at it, I see the duck. On the one on the left is the duck, is the first thing that I always see when I look at it.
Yeah, and I think you told me that this is what the oldest optical illusion that's actually been like drawn that's out there. So I'm
Yeah.
willing to bet other people have already seen this too. And I mean, I happen to be on the other side on this one. The first thing that I saw when I saw this optical illusion back in like first grade was a bunny. But I think I'm a little bit more biased towards bunnies than ducks. So that's a thing. On our next one on here, we've got another double image. And for this one, I always have trouble with the second one, but I always see a young woman first.
Mm.
What do you see
Yeah.
first?
I used to see the young woman first. So for folks who haven't seen this one before, the young woman, her hair is the black, and you're seeing kind of the side of her cheek. So you can see her eyelash and her nose, and then like the rounded side of her cheek, and then her ear. So I used to see the young woman first, but I actually now, after looking at it more, I see the old woman first. So the old woman, the cheek becomes the nose, and the ear becomes the eye, as well as sort of her necklace becomes the mouth. So I think that's been interesting how that's changed. And I was actually working with a group of students, and one of the students said they had never been able to see the old woman until very, very recently, which was a really cool sort of, I don't know, revelation, which we'll get into a little bit more when we start talking in depth about why are we actually showing you these things?
Yeah, absolutely. And this last one on here is it could be two faces. It could also be a vase. And just to bounce off what you just said about that student who had never like seen the old woman before, I think the point that's really helpful about that is sometimes to see the other thing, you really have to focus on trying to see the other thing. And in some cases, you have to ask for help. So getting those clues, like talking about where the jawline is, talking about how different pieces of that image transform into other pieces. I'm sure those clues gave way more help to someone who was trying to maybe struggle with trying to find that other dialectic. But the way that these kind of relate to our lives is that the same thing can be said for anything that's going on in our world. There is always another perspective to what's going on. The example that I heard, it's kind of a silly example, back when I was first learning about dialectics, is a story about a tiger that escapes from the zoo. So if you are out hanging out with your friend and your friend suddenly like sees a tiger down the street, the tiger's running towards you guys, and the tiger totally eats your friend's head. That's a bad day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad day. Your friend is just dead now. There's a tiger rampaging around the city. It's really not great. But thinking about the dialectic is the major question. What is being left out? How's the day going from the tiger's perspective?
Also probably not great and scary. I mean, if I was a tiger in a zoo and then like got suddenly let free and then was just like, oh God, I need to
Maybe that's where that impulsiveness is showing up, because when I was thinking about it, I'd be like, sweet, I'm free.
oh
Channeling my cat a little bit. Like, I know if he got beyond my banister, he would be like totally vibing, like loving it, like out in the wild with new snacks, all of that fun stuff. Like, I bet in the zoo, they don't get very much variety of food. So, like, to the tiger, a human might be a pretty good snack. We don't know, right? It's a dialectic. From my perspective, of course, I'm like, no, that sounds awful. But there's always another perspective out there, even if it's not human sometimes. So I really like that story because it challenges you to really consider things that you might not consider otherwise. And sometimes you do have to focus. Sometimes you do have to ask for help to see that. And dialectics really are really, really helpful for viewing your world. Something else that really kind of racked my brain a lot when I was younger is the idea that reality is a social construct. Everything that you have in your reality, everything that you interpret and see, your relationships are based on past relationships, past experiences, what meanings you assigned different objects. Everything that you have in your world is filtered through that lens. So, using that same logic, everyone has a different filter. No one can have the same perspective, and literally no one can ever have the exact same journey as another person. You cannot stand in the same space as someone at the same time. So remembering that dialectics are just a natural part of our world, and just because you don't agree with something, or just because that's not the first thing you see, doesn't mean that there's any less truth to the other side of that. So considering both things at once, and again, bringing back our acceptance and our change. and how we have to strike a balance between those two things. So just to summarize, dialectics acknowledge that there's more than one way to see a situation, and it teaches us that there's also more than one solution to a problem. Delaney and I have been chatting a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons as a new adventure that we're both kind of foraying into. And I think Dungeons and Dragons is a great example of different ways to solve a problem. Like if you've got one party doing one thing to kind of combat this horde of ogres, and you've got another party who's just like, we're just gonna skip it, we're gonna evade these guys and go on to the next town. Those are both valid solutions to a problem, and they're completely different. Dialectics also show us that everyone has a different point of view. And in fact, I like the word reminds us that everyone has a different point of view. And really the point of it is finding a way to honor the truth on both sides of a conflict. Again, like what I was saying earlier, where reality is kind of a social construct and everyone has a different view of reality. The other thing is like all feelings are always true. Your feelings are entirely based on your perspective. So there is truth on either side of a conflict. It might not fit the facts, but again, honoring the truth on either side means looking at what is true and taking both of those pieces at the same time. And as well, more of like a practical way of thinking of it, it's a move from thinking about things in either or, black and white, or always and never, and moving more towards and. So instead of whenever you think of the word but is actually, and like my English teacher once taught me this, there's a thing called the but eraser. Delaney, have you ever heard of that?
Yep.
Yeah. It's this idea that if you add but into something, particularly when you're talking to someone or particularly with a compliment, that's the way I always heard it. If you say but at the end of it, you're kind of erasing everything about the first thing that you just said. Buts naturally are not dialectic. So instead, replacing all of the things where you're tempted to say but with and instead. So synthesizing dialectics or coming to that compromise, using dialectics to actually like change your worldview and bring things together is like a compromise. It's challenging your minds to come up with how seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time, or walking the middle path. That's another name for like choosing dialectics or thinking dialectically. So Delaney brought this one up earlier, but I am doing the best I can, and I need to do better, try harder, and be more effective and more motivated to change. Thinking about that but eraser, reading that statement from the perspective, I am doing the best I can, but I need to do better, try harder, be more effective and more motivated to change. That's just kind of bagging on yourself. It's not very helpful to read that. And therapy, a lot of the time, is all about thinking about what thoughts you're having and what cognitive processes you're having that are accurate and helpful what your goals are. If you are downgrading your own self and your own thoughts, then you have no real chance of trying to come out stronger from those things or have that self-compassion of recognizing where those two things are happening. Next one is I can do this and it's going to be hard. Those two things can absolutely be true at the same time. And this is my actual favorite one. I did not create or cause all the problems that I'm facing, and I am the one able to take control of the situation now to solve those problems. Delaney, do you have any like favorite dialectics off the top of your head?
One of the things I think of is I really like the movie Inside Out. And in Inside Out, you know, it has the emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, envy, disgust, and sort of the end result of the movie in terms of like memories, because there's sort of this hyper focus on like, oh, we only want happy memories. We only want happy memories. We don't want sad memories. But in the end, there is a memory that it's like sort of represented in this orb that contains happiness and sadness, and it's kind of blended together. And so I really like to think about things can be happy and sad. You know, change can be scary and exciting. There's things that we, you know, like thinking about return to school, right? It is scary. We're going to lose things, right? Like I'm going to lose the ability to just walk over there and get a snack out of my fridge, but I'm also going to gain things such as being able to be in a space with other people, you know, socially distant and appropriately, but being able to be in a different environment is going to be a change. So there's kind of always just, you know, that yes, and right. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so how do we do this? like we've been talking about, both and thinking. So whenever you notice yourself thinking that but, or even just saying that but, something that I do is just interrupt people. I'm like, and is the thing. It's kind of like that Yahoo button or the Yahtzee button. If you can like find a way to just interrupt your thinking and just replace those things with ands, it opens up a lot. And it's actually kind of fun to challenge each other to come up with those sentences. As well, thinking again about cognitive patterns, noticing when you're thinking shoulds, musts, or ought tos, because those kind of imply that there is one right way that someone can interact with the world. And that's simply just not true. As well, avoiding always and never, again, that black and white thinking, practicing perspective taking. So one of my favorite activities for this is thinking about your favorite Disney villains or Pixar villains and practicing validating those characters, because oftentimes I've found that a lot of Disney movies, especially recently, are doing a really good job about making their villains three-dimensional characters. Another option of that is like thinking about your video game characters, like what are the evil guys doing? Like what are the ways that you can validate what they're doing, or why are their goals their goals? Checking your assumptions. And I'm going to link that to the last two bullets on here too, but don't expect others to know what you're thinking, and don't assume that you know what others are thinking. Mind reading is not a thing. As a therapist, and I've known a lot of people who think therapy means that you can mind read. That is not true. That is simply not a skill that humans have. You don't know what others assume about you, and you can't know that the things you assume about others are actually true or not. The only way to actually figure those things out is if you talk to that person and ask and figure out what their perspective is. And I find that a lot of this black and white thinking, a lot of those shoulds, musts, ought tos, a lot of those always and nevers often come up when we're assuming that we know what other people are thinking, and the ways that other people are intending to interact with their environments. And the one that I like on here too, that is really helpful, especially when talking to other people, is using I feel statements. Talking from your perspective. Again, feelings are always true. They might not fit the facts, but based on your perspective, the things that are going on around you, the things that you notice in your world, and the feelings that you're having in response to your world, your feelings are true. You can always speak from the heart in that sense. And in that way, you are not saying anything about the other end of that dialectic. When you use an I feel statement, you are just speaking about your end. And naturally, it opens up the possibility that there is another perspective out there. Someone else might feel differently. Anything to add on these, Delaney?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. And, just as much as I wish I was, I'm not a mind reader, even though I'm a therapist.
Someone super cool, but also very invasive.
Yes, someone I know did tell me that us therapists are professional feeling guessers, but that's about as close as we can get, is just
It's true.
Professional feelings guessers.
Yeah, I like that title. We should change our titles.
So we wanted to, as always, give you something tangible on how to practice doing this. Like how can this show up in your life? So if you have the handout, we're going to walk through. You can use that if a situation comes up, but just kind of walk through with each other. How can we do this? So Kaylin, do you have a situation recently that came up where you were either feeling confused or stressed or worried about something that maybe happened to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually already talked to you about this, but I'm happy to keep talking about it because it's still on the brain.
Sure.
But my washing machine in my apartment, it's a stackable, so it's got my washer and dryer together. But my dryer, I have to dry my clothes 3 times to get them actually dry. So long time ago, I asked my maintenance guy for a new washing machine, and he ordered me one, and it was sitting in my garage for about 3 months because he needed to hire someone else to help him get the thing into my apartment. Very grateful for that, and I was biding my time being patient. Long story short, yesterday, some guy came and took my washing machine from in my garage and gave it to someone else in my apartment complex.
Yeah, so the second part of this would be describe how you feel or acted in the response to this situation. I mean, I know because we've talked about it, and I know based off what you've said so far, I can imagine that's pretty frustrating.
I felt outraged. I was so mad. And I was thinking back on my day, and I even watched them take a washing machine past my window. And I was like, now I know that was my washing machine. And I had this thought in my brain because I made like awkward eye contact with one of the guys as he was going by. And I was like, ooh, the reason you looked at me like that was because you knew that was my washing machine.
Mhm.
Not true.
What did you do? Have you done anything yet about this situation?
Yes, I did. I went and I called my leasing manager and I was like, hey, this is what's going on from my perspective. What is happening? What the heck?
Okay, awesome. So that would be kind of moving into the third part of it. So describing both sides of the situation, the dialectics side A. So I imagine that would be kind of what you would fill in there as you called the leasing officer agent and you were like, hey, yo, I thought I was going to get a new washer and dryer. There was the one in my garage for 3 months and I just saw it leave. Are you going to put it in my apartment? Because that'd be pretty dope.
That's
right?
pretty much what I said.
Exactly. I'm sure you said those exact things. I'm curious, what did the leasing agent say? Because that might be kind of side B or give us into that perspective of like, why did that happen?
So something that I left out when I was just describing the situation, because it wasn't relevant to me or the situation, was that we actually had a change in our maintenance team like a couple of weeks ago. So she told me that the old guy had not made any documentation at all that that washing machine was supposed to be for me. And their new maintenance guy just found it on a walk around the property earlier this week, and they could not find who it was supposed to go to. So they gave it to someone else who had also been waiting for a while.
So thinking about four, how can you honor both sides of that? Honor your frustration and then also honor the fact that, that's kind of what happened in those, that's how it got documented. That's how it laid out. Is anything insight you can add to that of like, how do you do that?
I mean, I think acceptance of my frustration and my annoyance about the situation is one thing. And there's also just some acceptance of like, that's how it works. If there's no documentation, there's no documentation. And if this other person needed it worse, technically my clothes do dry. It is not completely broken. And this other person, what if their clothes don't dry? So kind of just practicing some radical acceptance, a skill that we'll get to in several weeks. And just noticing like, hey, I can have my frustration.
Mhm.
And that's okay.
And I imagine when we get to the fifth point of like the outcome of you thinking that way probably gives you some sort of relief to some extent. You can still be frustrated, but at the same time, you're like, oh yeah, okay, I don't know who this other person is that got my washer and dryer. Maybe you can have some sort of like some empathy you're describing of maybe their clothes don't dry at all. Like I'm thinking like maybe that person has a bunch of kids or like a new baby that throws up all the time on the onesies and like really they do need to do laundry, which is why they like completed all the paperwork. And ultimately you're like, okay, well, it's not ideal, but you can complete the paperwork to get your dryer fixed, whatever it might look like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even if there was no documentation before, now my leasing manager is like, yes, now I know about this situation. So she can try and solve it, which apparently she wasn't able to do before.
Nice.
Yeah.
We have another example, just so we can run through quickly on the next slide. I did another one that often comes up quite frequently with the youth that I use. I texted my friend asking if they wanted to hang out that evening and they never texted me back. They use red receipts, which are personally the bane of my existence, and they never opened the message. So it just said delivered and they never opened it. So I thought that they had ignored me. So I ignored them the next day at school in first period. So because I thought they ignored me, I returned the favor. Both sides of the situation, I was missing my friend, wanted to hang out with him. I recently got into a fight with my parents and wanted someone to talk about it, which is why I was texting them. On their side, though, I found out later they were working on a group project for school that was due the next day, so she didn't see her messages and was up late working on it. So by honoring both sides, I can acknowledge that I missed my friend and I can be sad that they didn't get back to me. And they're also allowed to be busy and get back to me when they can. Ultimately, the outcome is feeling more compassionate towards my friend and also maybe communicate about what happens next time, especially with like your situation, Kaylin. You have a clear understanding now of like, okay, when something breaks, this is now the process. And if anything, it sounds like maybe with the new maintenance team, stuff will get done quicker instead of like 3 months having washer, dryer.
It would be nice.
That'd be nice. So What's always great about these situations is sometimes it lets us do things differently in the future, especially when it comes to other people, because you're able to have those communicate with each other, like, this is what happened to me, this is my experience, so now in the future I know, okay, this is actually what happened, or you can get more clarity or more understanding about that other person, right?
Yeah.
So that's another example we have for that. Which leads us to the end of the material we had to present to you all today. If you have any questions or comments, nothing has come through the chat thus far, but if you have anything you'd like to share with us or question us, please feel free to drop that into the chat. We will be doing it anonymously in the sense of we will read it out loud and not say your name or who you are, but if you have anything, we would love to hear it. And that's actually all the material we have today. So give you a second to do that. If you have something.
I would guess that we probably won't get very many comments or questions on this first one. Should we just move on?
Yeah, go for it.
And as always, folks are welcome to ask us questions on this material next week or any week after as well. So if you're late to the game, feel free to still bring those questions up later. But again, if you need to reach out to us, we are currently offering virtual services as well as in-person services. To read more information about those virtual services, that link is right there. To call us to inquire about services as well, you're welcome to chat with one of us instead, but that number that's displayed there, the 747-4937, goes to our open access intake team. And as well, you're allowed to follow us on social media, see what other things that we are up to on any given day. And then for crisis resources, if you need to reach someone immediately for a mental health crisis or substance use crisis, or you just really want to talk to someone right now, feel free to call the King County 24-hour crisis line, contact Teen Link, which is open 6 to 10 p.m. and is there as a peer-to-peer resource for teens. And then as well, the crisis text line for those of you who might prefer to text instead of call someone, that is also available.
Yeah, so that's our first of the 16-week series that we're going to do. All of the materials will be posted on the YES website. You should be able to find that link on the flyer with the same link that you used to register as well. Everything's going to be posted there, the recordings, our slides, and the handouts. So if you can't join us next time, you can catch up there, as well as maybe if you don't want to join a live event and you just want to see us chat back and forth, you can watch the video at your own time, your own pace. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can, again, always show up and drop things in the chat or reach out to YAS, however that works best for you. So thank you for joining us. Again, signing off, Delaney, Youth Eastside Services, and Kaylin, otherwise, thanks for being here.